We just want to know what happened and why our baby didn't come home.
Of the scalp, brain removal, Y-shaped incision of the anterior torso, and he talked about the organs being removed.
12 inches by 8 inches. That's the measurement a forensic pathologist read out loud, in front of a packed ballroom, to a mother who has been waiting 3 weeks to hear anything real about what happened to her son. 12 by 8 inches of unexplained red discoloration, buried deep in the soft tissue on the back of Nolan Wells's head. Not a bruise you could see by looking at him. Not something anyone photographed at the scene. Something a pathologist only found when he cut beneath the skin, weeks after the body was recovered, weeks after the state had already finished its own exam and already kept parts of his neck for themselves. The pathologist's own words tonight. He cannot rule out foul play. Not there was foul play. Not this proves someone hurt him. Something much more careful, and in a way, much more haunting. A statement that leaves the door open, because nobody has been able to close it. Tonight we're going to walk through exactly what this new report says, what it doesn't say, why a missing bone in his neck matters more than almost anything else in this case, and why the answer to how did Nolan Wells die may still be weeks away, even after this. Before we get into it, if you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this case is moving fast, and we're going to be tracking every update as it comes in, fact by fact, without the speculation. Let's get into it. This update didn't happen quietly. It didn't happen in a press release buried on a Friday afternoon, and it didn't happen in a small conference room back in Mississippi where this case actually began. It happened this morning at the 117th NAACP National Convention in Chicago, in front of a standing room-only crowd. Attorney Ben Crump stood at the podium. Beside him stood Nolan's parents, Christine and Elmore Wells, 3 weeks into what is very possibly the worst stretch of their lives. And beside them stood NAACP President and CEO Derek Johnson, meaning this wasn't just a family's attorney making an announcement. This was the sitting leadership of one of the oldest civil rights organizations in the country, physically standing behind this family, lending their full institutional weight to what was about to be read out loud. And what was read out loud mattered, because up until this morning, everything the public had heard about Nolan's death had been secondhand. Timelines. Disputed witness accounts. A blurry video nobody could agree on. Process updates about what investigators were still looking into. This was the first time, from either side, state or independent, that anyone had stood up and described, in actual medical language, what was physically found on Nolan's body. Let's talk for a second about why Chicago and not Mississippi. Because that choice wasn't random. A national convention with press from across the country produces a completely different reach than a regional press conference back home. And that's been true of how this family and their legal team have approached this case from nearly the beginning. A consistent choice to use visibility and public pressure as a tool, rather than working quietly through official channels and hoping the system moves on its own. You can agree with that strategy or you can question it, but you cannot say it hasn't been deliberate. And today was, by a wide margin, the biggest and most consequential example of it yet. Before we get into what was actually found, it matters who found it, because credibility is going to become a recurring theme in this update. Dr. Roger Mitchell is a board-certified forensic pathologist, and he currently serves as president of the National Medical Association, the oldest and largest professional organization representing Black physicians in the United States. Before that, he spent 7 years as chief medical examiner for Washington, D.C. His examination of Nolan's body took place on July 10th. That's 6 days after Nolan disappeared, and 4 days after his body was recovered off the northwestern shore of Horn Island. Which means something important. Mitchell's exam happened after the state's own autopsy, not before it, and not instead of it. This was a second look, conducted independently, on a body that had already been through one official examination. From nearly the start of this case, Christine and Elmore have said publicly that they wanted someone with zero ties to Mississippi law enforcement, someone whose conclusions couldn't be waved away as biased toward or influenced by local officials. A national leader in Black physician advocacy, based out of state, funded entirely by outside supporters rather than any government agency, that checks almost every box that request could realistically ask for. Whatever his findings end up meaning, His independence from the systems this family has expressed distrust in is about as clean, on paper, as it could be. That context matters, because everything that follows should be read through that lens. This is a doctor with no reason to shade his findings in anyone's favor. He's not fighting for a conviction. He's not defending a department. His job was simply to look and to say plainly what he could and couldn't determine. Reading directly from Mitchell's report, Crump laid out the central conclusion first, and it's worth sitting with before anything else. Cause and manner of death, undetermined, pending further investigation. That single word, undetermined, is going to carry almost the entire weight of tonight's episode. It is not a conclusion. It's an honest admission that the evidence, as it currently exists, does not point clearly enough in one direction to make a call. We're going to spend real time tonight unpacking everything that led to that word. But it's important to say clearly, right at the top, nothing in this report says Nolan was murdered. Nothing in this report says Nolan simply drowned, either. What this report does is document, in careful clinical language, exactly how much is still unknown and exactly why. Before we get to the finding that's driving headlines tonight, it's worth spending real time on what Mitchell's exam did not find, because those negative findings matter almost as much. Mitchell reported no fractures anywhere on the body, no deep tissue injuries beyond the single area we're about to discuss, no lacerations to the overlying skin, no fractures to the underlying skull. In plain terms, across most of Nolan's body, this independent exam did not turn up the kind of injuries you'd typically expect from a severe beating, a violent fall, or a prolonged physical assault. A body that had suffered that kind of trauma would usually show a range of injuries: bruising in multiple places, lacerations, fractures consistent with whatever specifically happened. That absence doesn't clear anyone. It doesn't rule out something happening to Nolan, but it does narrow the range of realistic scenarios. It moves the case away from a picture of a prolonged, violent assault and towards something more specific, a single, localized event. One that could be entirely consistent with an accidental drowning, or one that isn't. That's exactly the question this case is still trying to answer. To be thorough about how this exam was conducted, Mitchell performed additional dissections that hadn't been done during the first autopsy, specifically to rule things out. That included facial dissection, a posterior head and neck dissection, dissection of the ribs, the pelvis, the subcutaneous and deep soft tissue of the back, the buttocks, the arms, and the legs. This wasn't a cursory second look. It was methodical, and it was designed specifically to either confirm or eliminate the possibility of blunt force trauma across the entire body. Across all of that, nothing. Until the back of the head. Here's the finding driving tonight's entire conversation. During the layered dissection of the back of the head and neck, Mitchell identified a focal area of red discoloration, 12 inches by 8 inches, located in the deep soft tissue overlaying the occipital bone. That's the bone at the base of the skull, toward the back. The cause, in Mitchell's own words, unknown. I want to be precise about what that actually means, because it's easy for a number like 12 by 8 inches to sound more dramatic in isolation than the medical reality actually supports. This is not a bruise in the way most people picture one, something you'd notice just by looking at skin. This was found during the internal portion of the exam, deep beneath the surface, and critically, there was no corresponding skull fracture and no laceration to the skin above it. That combination, significant internal discoloration with no visible external injury and no fracture, is unusual enough that a pathologist would want a clear explanation. It's exactly why Mitchell flagged it explicitly, rather than noting it in passing. But here's the honest complication, and Mitchell was transparent about this himself. The body had undergone marked decomposition by the time he examined it. Decomposition can obscure whether bruising was present or absent on the skin's surface. So this finding sits in a genuinely difficult middle ground. It could reflect an impact. It could reflect something tied to the physiological process of drowning itself. It could reflect decomposition. It could even reflect handling of the body during recovery and transport from the water. Mitchell's report does not claim to know which of these it is. It documents that the finding exists and that its origin is currently unexplained. Mitchell's own language on this point, read directly from the report. These findings are inconclusive for perimortem injury due to both the extensive decomposition and the absence of associated injuries. This finding, however, is significant enough to be highlighted in this preliminary report for further investigation. It's also worth noting something structural here. This finding could not have been made during the first autopsy because that posterior head and neck dissection wasn't performed the first time around. It only exists because a second, independent examination happened at all. So why does this matter, even without a confirmed cause? Because before today, every theory in this case involving potential trauma was built on secondhand claims, a disputed video, competing witness accounts, speculation traded across social media. Today, for the first time, there is an actual documented physical finding from an actual board-certified pathologist in an actual written report. That doesn't prove Nolan was harmed by another person. It means the question of what caused that specific area of discoloration is now a real, answerable forensic question, one that further testing and direct comparison against the state's own autopsy photographs and notes could eventually help resolve. Now we get to what I'd argue is the single most important detail in this entire update, more important, in some ways, than the discoloration itself. When Mitchell received Nolan's body for the second autopsy, the interior internal neck structures were missing. Specifically, the trachea, the laryngeal cartilage, the thyroid horn, and the hyoid bone were not received with the body. Mitchell's report states plainly that it's assumed the initial pathologist retained these structures for additional evaluation. And to be fair to Mississippi's medical examiner's office here, that is a recognized, standard practice in forensic pathology. Retaining certain tissue or structures after an initial autopsy, for further testing or for legal evidentiary purposes, isn't unusual or inherently suspicious. Mitchell himself, drawing on his own 7 years as DC's chief medical examiner, said that if there had been any concern about the throat, any suspicion of fracture or compression, he would have retained those structures too, in that exact same way. But here's the problem it creates. The hyoid bone is a small, U-shaped bone in the neck, and it happens to be one of the specific structures medical examiners look at when trying to determine whether strangulation played any role in a death. A fractured hyoid is a well-known, classic indicator examiners check for in exactly that kind of case. With that bone already in the state's possession before Mitchell's exam even began, he had no way to examine it himself. Mitchell's own words on this, read directly. A posterior neck dissection performed without review of the anterior neck structures is incomplete. Therefore, this pathologist cannot rule out injury to the neck as a contributor to or cause of death. I want to be exact about what that sentence is and isn't saying. It is not Mitchell saying he found evidence of strangulation. It is Mitchell saying he was never given the physical opportunity to check for it, using the one part of the body specifically built for checking it. That's not a minor procedural footnote buried in an appendix. That is arguably the single most consequential limitation in this entire report, because it's the one gap that most directly touches the question of whether Nolan may have been physically harmed by someone else, rather than simply drowning on his own. Crump has now formally requested that Dr. Mitchell be given direct access to the state's findings, including whatever the completed toxicology screening eventually shows, and that Mitchell be personally included when this case is presented to a Mississippi grand jury. That request deserves real scrutiny, because it isn't a small ask. Grand jury proceedings are typically presented by a single prosecutor, working from evidence gathered by official investigators, without independent outside experts brought in to offer a second, potentially differing interpretation. Whether that request is granted could end up being one of the most consequential procedural decisions in this entire case, because it determines whether the eventual grand jury hears one unified account of the physical evidence, or two expert interpretations that may not fully agree. There's one more major limitation in this report, and it connects directly to the biggest missing piece in this entire case: toxicology. Mitchell's independent exam did not include a toxicology screening, and the state's own toxicology results, the ones meant to accompany their original autopsy, still haven't come back either. Jackson County Coroner Bruce Lind has confirmed directly that the state's autopsy report remains unfinished, specifically because it's still waiting on that same category of testing. That's worth sitting with, because it means both investigative tracks, the state's and the family's independent one, are currently stalled at the exact same bottleneck, through two completely separate systems, two separate examiners, two separate labs. That undercuts any suggestion that one side is deliberately dragging its feet while the other races ahead. Both are waiting on the same slow, unavoidable step, and neither can simply speed it up on demand, no matter how much public pressure builds. Now here's the part that explains why this step is so unavoidable, and it's genuinely important to understand if you want to follow where this case goes next. Drowning produces something called pulmonary edema, fluid buildup in the lungs caused by the body's oxygen deprivation, shutting down normal function. Here's the complication. A drug overdose produces the exact same kind of pulmonary edema through a very similar physiological pathway. Looking at the lungs alone, even under a microscope, even during a full standard autopsy, cannot reliably tell the two apart. That's why, in forensic pathology, drowning is often described as a diagnosis of exclusion. You don't confirm it directly. You rule out the alternatives first, especially an overdose, and only once those are eliminated does drowning become the remaining, supported explanation. Toxicology is the tool that actually does that ruling out, and it can take 6 to 8 weeks to come back. There's also a physiological detail worth understanding about how drowning itself unfolds. When someone drowns, water is inhaled into the lungs, but the person is often also swallowing and gulping water at the same time, sometimes bringing some back up, then swallowing again. That can leave water in the stomach, something examiners sometimes look for, though it's not always reliably present. And occasionally water shows up in a specific area near the sinus cavity too. None of that changes the core problem. The lung findings themselves, the actual signal of respiratory failure, look essentially identical whether the cause was drowning or an overdose. Only toxicology can meaningfully separate the two. And here's a scenario worth naming clearly, because it's a real, plausible middle ground that hasn't gotten much public attention. If toxicology eventually shows a substance in Nolan's system, that would not necessarily eliminate drowning from the picture. Medically, it's entirely possible for a cause of death to be recorded as a combination. Drowning as the immediate physical cause, with a specific substance listed as a contributing factor. Fentanyl is sometimes used as an illustrative example in these discussions of contributing factors in overdose-adjacent drowning cases. In a case like that, the manner of death would likely still be classified as accidental, not a homicide. That's a genuinely different outcome from either a clean drowning finding or a finding of deliberate foul play. I want to be very clear here, because this is exactly the kind of detail that gets misused in true crime coverage. There has been no suggestion from any source, official or otherwise, that Nolan used drugs that day, or that drugs played any role in what happened to him. This scenario is explained purely because it's part of the standard medical framework examiners have to work through, not because there's specific evidence pointing toward it in Nolan's case. We're raising it to explain the process, not to imply anything about the person. Mitchell's report also lists a set of outstanding questions he says are still essential to determining cause and manner of death. Was there water in the airway? Is there any evidence of injury to the anterior neck structures he never got to examine? Is there evidence of intracranial hemorrhaging? What was in the stomach contents? And critically, what do the toxicology results ultimately show? Every one of those remains open tonight. Separate from the medical findings, there's important first-hand testimony about the physical conditions in the water where Nolan's body was found, and it deserves real weight, because it comes from direct, repeated experience with that exact stretch of coastline. A representative of the United Cajun Navy, the volunteer search organization that assisted in locating Nolan, described the northwestern portion of Horn Island in detail. He said the current there is notoriously dangerous enough that people who work that water regularly have their own nickname for it. The washing machine, because the current rolls and churns in a way that can pull a person under quickly and unpredictably. This kind of testimony carries a different weight than either the forensic findings or the disputed witness accounts, because it's not someone reconstructing a single afternoon from memory. It's someone describing what that patch of water is generally like, based on repeated first-hand experience, independent of who happened to be swimming there on any given day. He also gave a specific, concrete detail. In that exact stretch of water, depth can shift from just 2 or 3 feet to as much as 20 feet within a couple of steps. That is an extraordinarily fast transition, the kind that can catch even a strong, confident swimmer off guard. especially someone unfamiliar with that specific stretch of coastline. And he made a point worth remembering, because it directly answers a question that's been asked repeatedly throughout this case. Not every person who drowns is heard screaming or seen visibly struggling. Depending on the current, the depth, and how quickly someone becomes overwhelmed, a drowning can happen quietly, close to shore, without anyone nearby realizing what's happening in time to help. That connects directly to something Ben Crump has asked publicly more than once. If Nolan was struggling in the water, why didn't anyone in that reportedly large beach crowd notice or step in? This account offers a specific, technical answer. If the depth genuinely shifts that dramatically within a few steps, and the current genuinely behaves the way this searcher describes, it becomes entirely plausible for someone to go from standing safely in shallow water to being swept into a dangerous, disorienting current in a matter of seconds, without producing the kind of visible, prolonged struggle that would draw a stranger's attention from any real distance. There's broader public health research worth adding here, separate from this specific case entirely. Drowning experts have long noted that real drownings rarely resemble the dramatic splashing and shouting most people picture, largely because of how these scenes are depicted in film and television. In reality, a drowning person's body is often physiologically unable to call out or wave for help at all, because it prioritizes the basic mechanics of trying to breathe over any other voluntary movement. That means an actual drowning can look, from a distance, deceptively calm, almost unremarkable, right up until it's too late for anyone nearby to intervene. That reality doesn't prove what happened to Nolan, but it does mean the absence of a visible, chaotic struggle isn't on its own evidence that something other than drowning occurred. According to this same account, Nolan's body was found in roughly the same area where whatever happened to him likely occurred, face down, fully clothed, in a position the searcher described as consistent with drowning. He noted that finding a body relatively close to where an incident occurred isn't unusual in that specific area, given how the currents behave there. That detail carries extra weight when placed next to the GPS and audio evidence covered in earlier updates on this case. The distress call, in which Nolan's friends reported their own boat taking on water, was made near the western tip of Horn Island. Nolan's body was later found at the northwestern tip, a similar, though not necessarily identical, area of the island. If this searcher's account of how quickly a body tends to settle near its point of entry is accurate, that overlap becomes considerably more significant, potentially narrowing down where things actually went wrong to a fairly specific stretch of coastline, rather than leaving it as an open question spanning the entire island. This same searcher was also asked directly about one of the more serious theories that's circulated publicly, that Nolan's body may have been moved and deliberately placed back in the water to make his death look like an ordinary drowning. He didn't dismiss the question outright, but he was clear that he personally doesn't believe that happened. At the same time, he made a concrete, practical offer. His organization has cadaver dogs, trained specifically to detect trace evidence of blood, even after an attempt has been made to clean it away, and he's offered those dogs directly to search the boat involved in this case. He referenced a prior case in Baton Rouge where his organization's dogs played a documented, instrumental role in helping locate evidence connected to a homicide, evidence that led directly to an arrest. That track record matters. It means this isn't an empty symbolic gesture. Whether that offer has been accepted, or whether the boat has already been examined through some other forensic method, hasn't been publicly confirmed as of this update. That's an open thread worth continuing to watch. He also raised a straightforward logical question about the phone, one worth taking seriously without treating it as proof of anything either way. If Nolan's friends had taken his phone with harmful intent, why keep it at all, rather than simply discarding it, or throwing it into the water, instead of holding on to it long enough for it to eventually reach Nolan's mother? That's not proof of innocence. But it's a fair, grounded question. It's also fair to weigh the other side honestly. Disposing of a phone is itself a conspicuous act, one that, if noticed or discovered later, would raise immediate suspicion on its own. It's entirely possible that keeping the phone was itself viewed as the safer, less suspicious choice, regardless of what may or may not have happened that day. Neither interpretation can be ruled out from this detail alone, which is exactly why it remains a genuinely open question. We've covered this before, but it's worth revisiting with the new context this update provides. Christine has described two separate location tracking tools, Snapchat's own map feature and the Life 360 app, showing conflicting information about where Nolan's phone actually was that day. One updates automatically. The other only updates when someone actively opens the app. That difference alone can explain some of the discrepancy. But Christine has also said that when she finally got access to the phone directly, there was nothing on it from that entire day. No saved photos, no saved snaps, despite Nolan's well-documented habit of constantly capturing and sharing exactly those kinds of moments. Here's important added context. Snapchat's own default behavior deletes content automatically once it's been viewed, and even unopened content typically disappears after about 30 days unless it's specifically saved. However, users can also manually configure their own accounts to delete content automatically after just 24 hours. Whether Nolan had that specific setting enabled hasn't been publicly confirmed, and that would be a meaningfully different scenario than content being deliberately deleted by someone else. Both possibilities remain open. Only a proper forensic examination of the account and the device can actually distinguish between them. A legal analyst weighing in on this case made an important, careful distinction worth repeating. Everything currently known about the phone's contents comes from the family looking at the device themselves and describing what they believe is missing. That is not the same thing as an actual forensic data extraction conducted by trained digital examiners capable of determining conclusively whether anything was deleted, when, and by whom. Until that extraction happens, what we have is a family's honest, troubling observation, not confirmed digital forensic evidence. That's exactly why the mutual, coordinated phone inspection both sides have agreed to matters so much. It's the process actually capable of turning this observation into something conclusive. That same analyst also pushed back gently on treating location data as fully reliable without qualification, noting that apps like Life 360 depend heavily on network signal, and a group of people gathered closely together, all using their phones at once, can actually interfere with each other's signal strength, potentially producing exactly the kind of inconsistent or delayed data being described. That doesn't mean the discrepancy Christine described is meaningless. It means drawing firm conclusions before a professional forensic download is complete risks getting ahead of what the evidence can currently support. Then there's the central contradiction that's defined this case almost from day one. Nolan's very last conversation on that beach. According to the young woman he was speaking with, Nolan told her he intended to head back and rejoin his friend's boat. According to the friends themselves, Nolan told them he wanted to stay behind with her. One framing says those two versions simply cannot both be true. But a defense attorney weighing in offered a genuinely different read, worth taking seriously. Both accounts could be partially true, depending on perspective and depending on details not yet publicly established. It's entirely conceivable Nolan told his friends he'd catch a ride with another group, and separately told the young woman he was heading back to the boat, without those two statements describing the same specific boat or the same specific moment. If a second, less publicly discussed group of friends genuinely existed, both accounts could be sincere, simply describing different pieces of a more complicated afternoon than has been reconstructed so far. That framing matters more now, given that Katie's own account, delivered directly to Christine and covered in earlier updates, turned out to be an honest assumption rather than a first-hand eyewitness claim. The same kind of nuance may apply here too. It's worth remembering how many people were reportedly on Horn Island that specific afternoon, estimates running into the hundreds, given the holiday. In a crowd that size, multiple overlapping friend groups, multiple boats, and casual acquaintances briefly crossing paths is entirely plausible. That complicates any assumption that Nolan's world that day consisted of only two groups. There's also the viral video, the one many people believed, at various points, captured Nolan in an argument shortly before he disappeared. On this, there remains genuine, real disagreement among people who were actually present. Some maintain the voice belongs to Nolan. Others, including a friend who has spoken publicly and repeatedly on this exact question, insist the voice is someone else entirely, and that the altercation captured on that recording involved a completely different dispute, unrelated to Nolan at all. Crump himself, when pressed directly, has acknowledged the uncertainty honestly, saying different witnesses have told his team different things, and that his team will be more careful going forward about specifying when a claim comes from a witness account rather than presenting it as confirmed fact. That's exactly the standard worth applying to every contested piece of evidence in this case, the video included. Now, the human dimension, because it deserves real space alongside all of this technical detail. A licensed psychotherapist discussing this case publicly used a specific clinical term for what Christine is living through: ambiguous loss. One of the most difficult forms of grief there is, precisely because it lacks resolution. In her framing, a parent's nervous system cannot begin to fully process a loss like this while the story of what actually happened remains genuinely unknown. She described Christine's last real memory of her son in devastatingly simple terms: a hug, a kiss, over a salmon dinner, and then silence. That image keeps resurfacing throughout this case, across interviews, press conferences, and now here. That repetition isn't accidental. It's a small human anchor point in a story otherwise dominated by forensic terminology, GPS coordinates, and legal procedure. A reminder that underneath every piece of evidence discussed tonight is a mother's memory of an entirely ordinary evening, one she had no way of knowing would be her last with her son. Ambiguous loss functions differently from more typical grief. In most losses, even sudden, tragic ones, there's eventually a clear, settled narrative to attach to. An illness, an accident, a specific, understood cause. That narrative, painful as it is, gives grief somewhere concrete to land, something the mind can eventually begin to process. Ambiguous loss withholds exactly that. Without a settled explanation, the mind keeps returning to the same unanswered questions, unable to complete the process ordinary grief eventually allows. That's why toxicology results, forensic findings, and investigative conclusions matter here in a way that goes beyond legal accountability. For this family, those findings are also, quite literally, the only path toward being able to grieve at all. As that psychotherapist put it, grief needs a story to attach itself to. Until this family has the truth, grief has nowhere real to land. Transparency in this investigation isn't only a legal or procedural issue. It's a mental health necessity for a family that cannot begin to properly grieve until they understand what happened to their son. Back in Chicago, NAACP President Derek Johnson didn't limit his comments to the medical findings. He directly criticized how this investigation has been handled so far, saying the organization is accusing officials of being derelict in their duty to ensure a proper investigation was conducted, regardless of what actually happened. That wording matters. Johnson isn't claiming, on behalf of the NAACP, to already know Nolan was the victim of foul play. He's arguing something narrower, but still serious, that the investigation itself, independent of its eventual conclusion, should have already met a higher standard of thoroughness and transparency than it has so far. This criticism isn't just rhetorical. The NAACP has formally passed a resolution calling on local, state, and federal authorities, explicitly including the Department of Justice, to conduct a complete, transparent review of how Nolan ended up left behind on that island, and what happened to him afterward. Having the NAACP's national leadership step in directly, rather than leaving this to local chapters, signals real internal deliberation about how significant the organization now considers this case within the broader landscape of civil rights concerns it tracks. That level of top-level involvement doesn't happen quickly or lightly. Alongside that institutional pressure, the reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction has grown substantially. It now stands at $125,000, jointly funded by Reverend Al Sharpton, Tyler Perry, and former NFL player Terrell Owens. At Nolan's funeral, just 2 days before this Chicago press conference, Sharpton had announced a $50,000 reward. In the span of 2 days, that figure has more than doubled. I want to be really clear about where this actually leaves us, because it would be easy to overstate what today's announcement means. What's confirmed? A 12 by 8-inch area of unexplained discoloration in the deep soft tissue on the back of Nolan's head. No skull fractures, no lacerations, no toxicology yet, from either the state or the independent exam. An incomplete examination, because the state retained key neck structures before the independent pathologist ever had access to the body. And a forensic pathologist's own statement that he cannot rule out foul play, specifically injury to the neck. What remains genuinely undetermined? Whether that discoloration resulted from another person's actions, from the process of drowning itself, from decomposition, or from handling during recovery. Whether the neck structures the state retained would have shown anything relevant at all. And whether toxicology, once it finally arrives, points toward an accident, an overdose, or something else entirely. This is the single most important thing to take away from tonight. An unexplained finding is not the same thing as a confirmed cause. A pathologist saying he cannot rule out foul play is meaningfully different from a pathologist saying he has found evidence of foul play. Both statements are true right now, and both deserve to be reported accurately, without collapsing one into the other. This case has already suffered from exactly that kind of collapse before, with the video, with an old photo taken out of context, with early witness statements presented as confirmed fact. Tonight's finding deserves better than that, no matter how dramatic a number like 12 by 8 inches might sound in isolation. So let's pull this entire update together. For the first time, this case has an actual documented physical finding, rather than only competing witness accounts and viral speculation. A pathologist has said plainly he cannot rule out foul play, specifically around potential injury to Nolan's neck, while also being transparent that his examination was limited by structures the state retained beforehand. Toxicology from both sides remains the single biggest missing piece, the one result capable of finally distinguishing between an accidental drowning, a drowning complicated by a substance in his system, or something else entirely. The NAACP has now formally entered this fight, with a resolution calling for federal involvement. The reward has grown to $125,000. And Ben Crump has laid out exactly what he wants next: direct access to the state's findings, and a seat at the table when this case finally reaches a grand jury. Nolan Wells was 18 years old, nearly 3 weeks after he disappeared during a 4th of July trip to Horn Island. His family finally has one real, documented physical detail about what was found on his body. It doesn't answer the question they've been asking since that very first night. But for a family living inside what one expert called ambiguous loss, an actual, specific finding, however incomplete, is still more than they had yesterday. There's a pattern worth naming as we close tonight. Every new piece of information in this case, the GPS data, the distress call audio, Katie's direct account, and now this autopsy finding, has done the same two things at once. It's added real, concrete substance to what was previously speculation, while simultaneously opening up new, more specific questions that didn't exist before. That's not a flaw in how this case has unfolded. That's simply what a genuine, careful investigation looks like from the outside. Incremental, occasionally frustrating, and only rarely delivering the kind of single dramatic answer true crime coverage sometimes promises. What this case has delivered instead, tonight included, is something slower, and in its own way, more honest. A steadily growing body of real, documented evidence, still being assembled into a complete picture that nobody, on any side of this story, has been able to fully see yet. We're going to stay on this. As toxicology results finally arrive, as the mutual phone inspection moves forward, as this case continues toward a grand jury, we'll bring you the facts as we actually get them verified, and not a moment before. If this update helped you understand where this case actually stands, do me a favor, hit subscribe, tap that notification bell, and drop your honest read on that missing neck evidence down in the comments. I read every single one, and I want to know what you think Mitchell's team should push for next. Thank you so much for spending this hour with us tonight. We'll see you at the next update.